Pittsburgh Steeler fans, welcome back to another episode of the Hangover. I'm Daniel, and alongside with me, as always, is Shannon. Shannon, how are you doing today?
Wonderful, beautiful day. Nice 70s. It's been hotter than that, but it's 70s right now. Just beautiful. So I've had a wonderful day. How about you?
It's been great, man. It's been great. We had a pretty good weekend. My wife's family was in town, and they had some younger kids that were around the same age as my daughters, and so they came over. They had a slumber party, so to speak. So we had a water balloon fight yesterday, and a barbecue and things of that nature. So it was been a lot of fun. It was an exciting weekend. Today's been a lot of rest. But today we continue our debate on ranking positional players. But before we do, I wanted to touch on a few rumors that have been kind of circling around the interwebs. And the first one is that there's some possibility of some camp holdouts, potentially one being a second round draft pick, Joey Porter Jr., who hasn't yet to sign his rookie contract. I, for one, don't think that those rumors are too high. But what are your thoughts on the possibility of Joey Porter Jr. not being there for training camp?
I, I think it's so much to do about nothing. I've heard the same rumors, and with the way the salary cap is now, and all these rookie contracts are slotted, so the what makes this year different is usually the 32nd pick is the last pick of the first round.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get that fifth year option because it's a first round draft pick. There's just staggered the contracts are, so you kind of know about what he's going to get paid, regardless. But he doesn't have the fifth year option because he's the first pick of the second round. Well, then Keanu Benton has partial amount of his third year guaranteed in his contract, which that's the first time the Steelers have ever done that. And so I'm sure that has something to do with it. And the Joey Porter Jr. saying, hey, I was taken before Benton, and, I'm actually in the 32nd slot, and I'm sure he's wanting some kind of recognition and compensation for that. So I figure they're just quibbling a little bit, getting these numbers straight. He hasn't missed anything yet. We're still a couple of weeks away from camp, and I believe that it'll get taken care of.
I do too. I think it will be taken care of. I don't think that. I think that it'll be taken care of before camp starts.
Yep.
Porter missing developmental aspect of football and training camp would be huge. I mean, that would be a huge, step back in his development. Mm-hmm. It would be a huge step back in the trajectory in which the Pittsburgh Steelers see Joey Porter Jr. being a contributor on the defensive side of the football. And so, in my opinion, I think it would be a mistake on his end to do so. I think he needs to get in there. He needs to build chemistry and camaraderie amongst his teammates, and he also needs to get a feel for the playbook and how other players are, positioning themselves and are, working out the plays. And so, in my opinion, I think it would be a huge step back for him. I don't think it's going to end up happening. I think it happens before camp starts, but even if it doesn't, I think he still shows.
One thing about it is, we got to remember his dad's Joey Porter Sr.
That's true. That is true.
And he knows the Steelers and the Roonies and how they conduct and handle their business, better than most. So I have to feel like that he's going to be like, I'm sure he's like, hey, guys, let's get this worked out. And, this is legacy. You want him here. He wants to be here. That's going to help get this worked out. But we know that the Steelers, they don't respond well to threats, threatening holdouts and stuff of that nature. Ask Le'Veon Bell. So I feel like that will get handled, and it's not going to be a big deal at all.
100%. 100%. Now, the other rumor of a possible holdout / hold-in, and I think this one probably has a little bit more weight to it, is Alex Highsmith and the reference of the actually not participating in training camp. He is also, I believe, in his last year of his contract. He's not getting paid very much. I think it's like $3 million this year. He had double-digit sacks last year. Um, I know that there's been, some communication with him and some leaks of that he's stated that things are going swimmingly or appropriately. Um, but it's also sparked up the rumor, not only is he going to hold in or hold out, but that he could be on the trading block. What are your thoughts on Alex Highsmith and his future with the Pittsburgh Steelers here in the near future?
Yeah, me and you kind of talked a little bit about that um, before the show, and this is the dead period of the off season. I mean, it's hard to find inspiration to write about, to do podcasts about. That's why we're doing the greatest all time at certain positions this week, leading up to training camp. And people get desperate and they write clickbait stuff. And you'll hear a lot of rumors right now, and you're like, well, that don't make any sense. Highsmith was just talking about how he's got a great relationship with Con. They're close friends, and that they have everything buttoned up for this extension, but they're just, going over a few things here or there. It might just be where he's on vacation right now with his family, and they're out doing something, and he's waiting till he's back in town to make everything official. But people, they're like, okay, what could the Steelers do? Well, we know Highsmith's a really good player. He might have some trade value. Why in the world would you trade one of your league best edge rushers? Him and Watt, I think, are the best edge rush tandem in the NFL. Why in the world? It makes no sense, especially at his age, with his future, his potential, how he wants to be in Pittsburgh. He loves it here. He loves the culture, and he's a perfect fit. I mean, there's some trade rumors I'm just like, well, you never know. That one is absolutely ridiculous. And, it could be that they find a snag somewhere and he does a little bit like Watt did. But if you remember, Watt went and told his agent, "Now I got this." He went and he said, "Let's just get it done." And I don't even think Highsmith will get to that point because Highsmith wants to improve. If we've seen anything, we're seeing a young man who was a college walk-on that has built himself, that he could have literally been in the Pro Bowl last year. That's how good and how far he's come. And I think he's only going to get better. And he understands that time away from his teammates hurts him, not just the team. And, because he has a goal here. He wants to be the best and one of the best. So I expect him to be at camp. I don't expect there to be any issues. And like I said, I've said it's going to happen the week before or the week of opening week of training camp.
I think that's a good possibility. I see, even if the Steelers were to, pick up that phone and get calls for Alex Highsmith, who are they going to replace him with? The drop off with the current, outside linebacker position is huge. And there isn't like there is, it's not like there's, outside linebackers that are capable of doing what Alex Highsmith has been shown to or proven to do, especially last season, out there just waiting to get picked up for $3 or $4 million a year. That's not realistic. And so, I don't find it to be, I think it very much the same, thinking the same as you are, that this is just, clickbaity stuff and just to get some more, views in. But, and to go along with that, the other rumor that I want to talk to you guys about is Aaron Donald. I mean, that one has resurfaced. That surfaces every single offseason. Or the Steelers going to trade for Aaron Donald. Now, there was a ESPN article that was released, and it was a top 10 defensive tackles for last year, for 2023, and it was created by executives, coaches, scouts that ranked the NFL. And in this article, it indicated that they felt that Cam Hayward was having a decline, that his age is catching up to him. He was ranked number 5 in 2022, jumped down to 9. And by one of the scouts stated, and in quote, "We thought he was starting to decline last year, which is expected to given his age." Well, first and foremost, one, did you see a decline last year in Cam Hayward? And two, if there is a decline this year, do you see the Steelers perhaps around the trade deadline? Because that's kind of where those rumors are indicating that if the Steelers go out and get an Aaron Donald, that it would be around the trade deadline, around the time that the Rams are figuring out they ain't going anywhere this year. And if the Steelers still have an opportunity to do something, maybe perhaps they pull that trigger. But first and foremost, do you think it's possible? What are your thoughts on Cam and any chance of this ever happening?
If you follow my articles or even the podcast in the past, last season, there was a point during the early part of the year that I thought Cam was slowing down. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned it. I said, I don't know what I'm seeing, but it's not the normal Cam Hayward. Well, there's a perfectly obvious reason, is because there was no TJ Watt. And it allowed teams to focus and double team Cam Hayward and Alex Highsmith much easier. Well, Alex Highsmith had to deal with endless chip blocks from running backs every time he would try to pass rush. Mm-hmm. And so that was the way they double teamed him. But they did a lot of double teams on Cam Hayward. So for an older player, I think 34 last year, an older player that had to deal with that, he wore down. He got tired because they had to have him out there. He got very little rest. Mm-hmm. The second half of the season, he looked like himself again. Now, TJ was back, but TJ was maybe 80% of his normal self. He was not the same pass rusher, not the same influencer. But his presence helped Cam because they was not able to just focus on double teaming him. So I think that it was a resurgent Cam Hayward. And one of the reasons why in the second half is his snap count went way down.
Right.
And that was because they was able to rotate in some, give him more rest, but the offense kept possession of the ball. Their time of possession was the top best in the league in the second half of the season. So that meant more rest between series, less total snaps. Well, we've seen the Cam Hayward look like himself again. So, to me, that's one reason why they got Keanu Benton. And that's one reason why they signed Breeden Fiaku and Armon Watts to get some depth there so that they can relieve Hayward more often and give him less snaps so they can keep him fresh. Because as the guy gets older, he needs fewer snaps just, because he's going to wear down quicker.
Right, 100%. And I saw that as well. I felt that last season, when TJ Watt went down, that there definitely was, an overworking of Cam. It sounded like, in training camp last year that it seemed like they wanted to lighten the work for him, lighten the load. And instead, I think they added more work. We saw him in positions like on the edge, nose tackle. And he played all positions in the defensive line there. And, at his age, you're absolutely correct. I think if, now with the Steelers, acquiring, Keanu Benton in the draft, Larry Ogunjobi is going to be healthy this year. I think that there's going to be an opportunity for Cam to not be, that guy that has to carry the load, so to speak. And I think that's going to do wonders for his play while he's on the field. I think that's going to prolong his career and perhaps maybe, he may not get the double-digit sacks because he's not on the field as much as he was before. But while he's on the field, I think he's going to make a huge impact. And I don't think it's going to be a huge loss in time either. I don't think he's going to lose a tremendous amount. But I do think that he is going to be on a snap count, so to speak, just because, he's going to be 35 this year, for defensive tackle. That's
getting up there.
Yeah, it is.
So what they were saying, I do agree with them, that there has been some natural regression just due to age. Nobody can defeat Father Time. It just doesn't happen. Sure. Now, as far as the Aaron Donald part, I didn't get to answer the second part of your question. It's Aaron Donald, I've heard different rumors, just as you have. Mm-hmm. I don't know what's true and what isn't. I've heard that he has a trade clause that he can control where he wants to go. and that Pittsburgh's not one of the destinations he wants to go to. So I don't know. That's just what I'd seen on Twitter.
Right.
I don't know if Aaron Donald can play for anybody. I mean, he's just that good. But you're getting a guy who's already talked about retiring after he won a Super Bowl. And I would think it more likely that Aaron Donald retires in the near future than I would him being traded to Pittsburgh. Just because I think that what he's meant to that franchise, he's up there with Deacon Jones and Burrow Olsen and Elder and them guys. I mean, some of the all-time great Ram players. And I think he's the type of guy that he'd say, well, I'd rather retire than play for somebody else.
Yeah, I agree. I think the fact that he also got a ring probably plays a huge role into his decision making, whether or not he would want to continue to play, because he's getting up there in age as well. He's not a spring chicken either, and so I can see that playing a role, and him having a ring. And I think if it comes down to it, I think you're absolutely right that perhaps he would hang it up before playing for another team. But one last. I guess it's not even a rumor anymore. It's probably a rumor from last year to talk about before we get into our player rankings, is that apparently Dove Kleeman out of Bro Bible wrote that while J.J. Watt was on the Greenlight podcast with Chris Long, he did, acknowledge that the Pittsburgh Steelers were a team that were high on his list last year as a team that he was considering joining, and that he thought that joining, playing with TJ and Derek Watt last year would have been huge. But the reason he ended up not doing so ended up being the financial. If he would have signed, then it would have been possibility that TJ's contract would have something would have had to been done with that one. Mm-hmm. But he did mention and acknowledge that the Steelers were indeed high on his list of potential teams. I know he's retired now, but, he's already talked about visiting training camp and being around. If he gets the itch, do you think that maybe perhaps the Steelers could be one of those teams that he goes and contacts?
Well, I think that all the players, one of the things on their bucket list, if they get the opportunity, is to play for not only the Pittsburgh Steelers, but play for Mike Tomlin.
Right.
I mean, Mike Tomlin is like universally recognized as the players' coach. Players just connect with him. He understands the business. He understands how to treat his athletes. I mean, one of the things that I think he doesn't get enough credit for is that he kept Antonio Brown pretty much in check for him to have those incredible seasons he had. Now, if you go back, and people say CTE and that hit by Burfett in the playoff game and all this stuff, Antonio Brown was a knucklehead forever. He got in trouble at 2 colleges for different, issues. The guy was picked in the 6th round, even though he had a ton of talent. Mm-hmm. He comes to the pros, and he's trying to make the team as a kick returner, and he has a really good rookie year. But he was having he was trying to get in line. His work ethic improved. Part of that Steelers culture, I think, that we talk about all the time, helped Brown. And it helped him focus. And then he went on to have a stretch of football that only Jerry Rice you could ever compare to. But the more stardom he got, and he became a superstar, then it started going to his head, and he started making very reckless decisions, whether it was on and off the field. And Mike Tomlin hid a lot of that. He allowed him to do things at training camp at Latrobe that the other players didn't get to do. How he did that without the other guys getting mad and pissed off and jealous, that shows a lot of how much they respected Tomlin and how much they wanted to win as a team. Because most times that happens on the team and it fragments the team. He fragmented the offense against the defense there with some fights he got into at training camp with Ryan Clark and Ike Taylor. And he even, the man made Troy Polamalu mad. That's not easy to do. So
Right.
Mike Tomlin has just he has so much respect from the players because most coaches couldn't get away with that. You'd see it in the news. Oh, he's got favoritism. You know, this guy can do this, and you didn't see that. We didn't
Mhm.
know about it until Brown finally went off the rails. So I think that JJ was being honest that he would have loved to play for Tomlin. He would have loved to be in all three Watt brothers on the same team. But he was honest that the money was more important.
Yeah,
Because the Steelers couldn't pay him what he got.
that's
So,
true.
I mean, I appreciate that honesty. I mean, guys all the time talk about how much this matters. They want to win a championship. And in the end, you show what matters, and it's usually the money because that's what they chase.
Yeah.
Because there is opportunities. You got to admit, a lot of those guys that went to Tampa and played with Brady, because that was the perfect confluence. That you get the guy who was the biggest winner ever at quarterback on that team. They had money, they had a lot of young players, but they filled that roster around him with a lot of veterans who come to Tampa to play for a championship. And a
Yeah.
lot of them got their Super Bowl playing on that team. So, there was a time where guys were like, I can probably make a little more money over here, but if I go to Tampa, I can play for a championship.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, depending on where you're at in your career, I think that's going to make the difference. And
Yeah.
plus, I think at the time in which where JJ Watt ended up signing with the Arizona Cardinals, I think they had some players that were moving towards that area. I think you had DeAndre Hopkins going out that direction. Kyler Murray was possibly going to be a guy. I mean, there was some word or talk or consideration of him. This is before, he had the no video games clause in his contract. And so, all those things were going, playing into that favor. I can understand that maybe perhaps he saw, more money plus an opportunity to play in the playoffs, and to maybe, do something more. Hindsight's always 2020, obviously. However, yeah, I think that maybe perhaps, if he does get the itch, which I don't think he's coming back. I think he's going to stay retired. That's my
I don't think he's
opinion.
coming back now.
But if he does, it would be nice. But I think a lot of things have to happen. It would have to be more than just JJ Watt wanting to come back. I think there would have to be like an injury or some sort of need for the Steelers to go out there and try to attract him to come out. But even if he does come back, it's not going to be the 3 Watts, Derek Watt. I don't think he's going to be a member of the Steelers this upcoming season.
Don't look like it.
It doesn't look like it at all. And so it would only be 2 regardless. That's all we have for the rumor aspect. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to finally get into the discussion of, best all-time Steeler centers. So don't go anywhere. YouTube, stay right here on the audio side. Just a few words from our sponsors. And we're back. Thank you for sticking with us and hanging on here on the Hangover. I'm Daniel alongside Shannon White. Before we get into our next topic of discussion, do you have anything that is coming out here in the near future? I know you're Beyond the Curtain call on Wednesday. Is that correct?
Yes. My podcast partner, Jeffrey Benedict, had to step away from both the editorial and the podcast side. As a family caregiver, there's only so many hours in a day, and he has his priorities in order, and so he's stepping away for a while, and so we're trying to. I've been having Kevin Tate and Big G from the homies. They've been filling in, and we're gonna try to make that permanent and moving forward. And I don't like change, but that's just being old and stubborn. But things happen, and it's been a great opportunity. So far, everything's went really well. And now we got another change coming up, as everybody knows, with the with our editorial side now moving to Fans First Sports Network and Steel Curtain Network, and so we've got a lot of changes here in the next little bit, but it's still going to be the same quality articles and hopefully entertaining and informative podcasts that we already doing. Of course, the podcast side we switched back in February, so that's been a while. And but that's how life is. It's full of changes, and a lot of times it's another opportunity and an open door, and so that's what we're looking forward to here in the next few weeks, and getting ready for the start of the next season.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to it. It's quickly approaching. We're still in that slow area, and as time gets closer, time slows down, in my opinion. So
Yeah,
it will eventually get here. But until then, let's talk about the players of the past, so to speak. And so today we're going to be talking about the center position. First and foremost, who is your favorite center that you've seen play for the black and gold, and who do you think is the best center to have played? Is it the same person? Is it two different players? And this is from your personal view.
Yeah, like last week was tough. When we were talking about the edge guys, I mean, I kept going around Jack Ham, Greg Lloyd, Debo, and it was so hard. This one is easier.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to start out, but I'm going to give the top 5.
Okay.
And it's Mike Webster, Dermontti Dirk Dawson, Marquise Pouncey, Ray Mansfield, who's definitely before your time.
Yeah.
And Jeff Hardy's. And I know you're very familiar with Jeff Hardy's.
Yes.
When you consider those 5 centers have been the primary centers for the Pittsburgh Steelers from late 60s to 2020, the Steelers have an unmatched stability in the head coaches. 3. Mm-hmm. But they've really had 5 primary centers because there was a 2 or 3 year period there that they had, a couple of guys that were more journeymen, and but that pretty much those 5 guys cover that whole time frame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my favorite I ever watched was Mike Webster.
Yeah.
Now, when I talk about Mike Webster, you understand I love offensive linemen. But offensive line, when I talk about my favorite players, hardly any offensive linemen come up. Mike Webster's always up there at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And the best center that I ever seen was Mike Webster. Now, some proof of why he was so great. 9 Pro Bowls. Yeah. 8 All-Pro teams. Well, he was 7 All-Pro teams, but he really made 8. But you'd have to look at the numbers. You're talking about a guy who was the starting center on the all-time team of the 70s and the 80s. And he played from 74 to 90. So his career actually covered 3 decades.
Mm-hmm. That's crazy.
Mike Webster was 6'1" and 255. Now, he got bigger, obviously, as his career went on. The guy was a freak. I mean, he was he was like Debo before Debo.
Right.
He was so strong, but he had shorter arms because he was a shorter man. He was a great wrestler, so he understood leverage. But he was one of the strongest players I've ever seen. And what he could do to guys that was, back then players were slightly smaller, but he could manhandle guys and just impose his will. But what he had to do, now you think about it, Daniel, he had to repeatedly ram his head into the sternum and the chest of these defenders because his arms were shorter. So he had to get inside. So if you watched him play, I've never seen a guy have so much contact with the top of his helmet because he had to, because he was going up against bigger guys.
Right.
There's guys that stood out through the years. And I get passionate and I get excited talking about Mike Webster. But I've never seen a guy. There was times that Webster come off. He looked like he was working construction in 110-degree heat, with no water. He would be on the sidelines, and you could tell he was hurting. He was bleeding. because he didn't wear sleeves, so you can see straight mark stuff. He looked exhausted, like he'll never be able to go back in the game, but he never missed. He had the record for the most consecutive games. That's why they called him Iron Mike.
Yeah.
The guy was like, Earl Campbell, we talked about running backs a while back, and I said the best power back, I ever seen was Earl Campbell. Mm-hmm. But Earl Campbell, you watch him, there was no joy in his game. He run over people. He didn't have Bettis' quick feet and all. So he would run over people, and then the teammates would have to help him up, and you're like, well, he's done. He'd get back to the huddle limping, and then he'd run another big run the next play. That's how it was watching Mike Webster. You had Hines Ward had that smile on his face, and it just exuberant joy in his game. Some guys stand out for their passion. You had Lloyd with his intensity.
Right.
Some guys stand there. The two guys I always think of that looked miserable was Earl Campbell at running back and Mike Webster at center. But it does not, he was that passionate. He loved the game that he'd give everything he had to give for all them seasons. And it doesn't shock me that he become the poster child for CTE and all the health issues he had after he retired, because that man took a beating like I had never seen just because of how he had to play the game. So the Steelers have had some incredible centers. Like I said, to me, the two best centers I ever seen is Mike Webster, and then the guy he trained as a rookie was Dermontti Dawson. And Dermontti Dawson was just that good as well. But when you look at everything, what he accomplished, the 4 Super Bowls, the all decades teams, the Hall of Fame, nobody compares to Mike Webster.
Yeah, 100%. I didn't get the privilege to watch him play live. I've seen some highlights. I've seen some of the classic games between the Steelers and some of their Super Bowl opponents and things of that nature. And I've been able to see and appreciate it from that aspect of it, but I wasn't around then. Mm. And so when I put my list together, I started watching, Pittsburgh Steelers football in the 90s. I was a little bit more limited. And so for me, on my number 5, I have, and 2 of them really probably shouldn't be on the top 5 list, but number 5, I have Mason Cole, because he looks like an all-pro next to Kendrick Green. You have, I have Justin Hartwig, because he helped the Pittsburgh Steelers get a Super Bowl. And then I have my 3 probably real top players at the center position, which would be, Justin Hardings, Dermontti Dawson, and Marquise Pouncey. And so, and for me, my favorite of those 3 centers probably would be Marquise Pouncey to watch. I thought he was his ability to get out in open field and his physicality and his athleticism put him over the top. And I thought that he was probably one of the best centers in the league while he was, playing the position. And so, I thought he did great. I think Dermontti Dawson was, in my opinion, probably the better player than Marquise Pouncey overall. But I was a little kid back then, so my what I remember is not very much. And their highlight, I guess, when it comes to the furthest they've gone, which was reaching the Super Bowl in 95, 96. Is a game that I've only seen once. So I have not seen yet since. And I don't plan on watching that game nor
you don't want to relive it.
Yeah, I don't want to relive, especially coming from Texas, my man. That was a painful couple of weeks there, and so that game, the 45 against the Packers, is another game. I think I saw the highlights for the first time not too long ago. And there's a lot of things I didn't even remember, but I've not watched the entire game since then. But to me, those guys are the guys that are the staple point for the center position. To me, I think that when you look at those guys, I think they could still play today in their prime. I feel that they're not, this position isn't too far ahead. Like, for instance, some people will look at, the quarterback position, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But they'll look at the quarterback position and say, well, the game has changed. The running back position, the game has changed. The usage, the dependability on those two positions, especially like on the running back position, is no longer to that level. It's more so of, more dependent on the quarterback now. And, the center position has somewhat changed. They're more in charge of, protections and things of that nature, and helping their quarterback than before. But I do feel that all these guys had it upstairs that they could have been able to continue to do that to this day. It's a fantastic position, and you mentioned how you have Mike Webster and then Dermontti Dawson. Those two guys played consecutively. It went from Mike Webster to Dermontti Dawson. So, that increases the bar very high, for Marquise Pouncey.
One thing I failed to mention is Dermontti Dawson was the, all-decade center of the 90s.
Right.
Marquise Pouncey was the all-decade center of the 2010s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're talking about for the last, that's 40 years worth of all-decade team centers on one team. Nobody can touch that. Not even come close. I mean, you're talking about some teams, you talk about a Dwight Stevenson or an Otto for the Raiders back in the 70s. There's been some other, good centers did not have the longevity of the Steelers center and did not, and they're looking to have one on their franchise list.
Yeah.
And the Steelers, the only thing I would give Dermontti Dawson and Marquise Pouncey, you don't remember Dawson much because of your age, but
right.
Pouncey and him were very similar in that they were very athletic. Really stood out at the center position, how athletic, quick feet, light on their feet, could pull. I mean, the Steelers have loved to pull their centers forever. But Pouncey, his one weakness is he struggled with power and size right over him.
Mm-hmm.
If he had a big, massive nose tackle. Now, thankfully, in his career, at that point, you're starting to see less and less of those guys like Casey Hampton, Vince Wilfork, those massive nose tackles that just overpower you. And Pouncey struggled with that size.
Right.
There was where Dermontti Dawson had a huge advantage on Pouncey. Is that even though Dawson was that kind of athlete, he just understood leverage and he never struggled against power and size right over him. So that's why Pouncey had to come in at number 3 on my list. But just because of that truth that Pouncey did struggle with size. Ray Mansfield is the guy that taught Mike Webster a lot. But you've got to look at Ray Mansfield that he played in the late 60s on some of the worst Steelers teams ever. Went through that. He was one of the few guys that Chuck Noll retained when he took over as coach. And they called him Ranger because he loved the outdoors and everything. But Chuck Noll said that he was his the connection between the new Steelers and the old Steelers. And he could remind people, remember how bad we was? We're going to buy all in on what Coach Noll is trying to do here because we don't want to be a laughingstock anymore. And he knows how to win. He's been part of winning organizations. So he was very valuable. People, we talk about who was the most important Steeler of all time. It's Joe Green, no doubt. Nobody will argue that because Joe Green's the foundation of everything. But on offense, that guy who was that foundation back in those days was Ray Mansfield. And I think that a lot of times we forget about him when we talk about the all-time great Steelers centers. But Ray Mansfield was a great player.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to see him. But who, in your opinion, we've talked about a lot of these great, centers. Who do you think is probably the most underrated center that's played for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
Well, I already said Ray Mansfield. Just, like I said, because but I would have to say Hardings because, again, Hardings come from Detroit where he was already a good player, but he took his game up a level when he got to Pittsburgh. And he really embraced the legacy and what it meant. See, I think you've seen that a little bit last year from Mason Cole. I know you mentioned him it was almost like a joke. But it really isn't, because guys who come in and they see a legacy that a franchise has and they buy into that, that's very, very valuable. And one thing that Cole does measure up to some of these guys we're talking about is his communication, his
Mhm.
leadership, what he meant to Kenny Pickett. Now, this was Kenny Pickett freely volunteering in a podcast of what it meant to have Mason Cole to help him. Because people don't understand that the center quarterback connection, how valuable and vital that is. And you'll see a lot of great quarterbacks. You talk about Peyton Manning, you talk about Jeff Saturday, right?
Mhm.
I mean,
Yeah.
Dan Marino had Dwight Stevenson. There's a lot of quarterbacks that were very, very successful for a long time. They trusted that center to call out line adjustments and protections. And there's a trust factor there. So I really, I think lived up to that unbelievable legacy that could have been suffocating for him. But he
Mhm.
fully embraced it, and he was a great player.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. And for me, I echo a lot of the same stuff that you just mentioned. Um, Hardings was my guy that I thought was probably the most underrated as well. But just for the sake of being different, I guess, for me, I guess then the next person that would be probably one of the more underrated guys would be Justin Hartwig. He was the guy that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
He won a Super Bowl for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He only played 2 seasons, and he had a pretty devastating holding penalty in that in the Super Bowl. Ended up working out for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that ended up costing the Steelers a safety. But in the end, ended up getting a ring. You don't get a ring without being good. You
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
you can't be a decent player and get a ring at the same time. Now I know a lot of why the Pittsburgh Steelers made it to the Super Bowl offensively had to do with, on the shoulders of Ben Roethlisberger and his arm and not Antonio Brown, Santonio Holmes. That not just the play at the end of that Super Bowl that was magnificent, but that entire drive. In fact, that entire playoff,
I was going to say the
run.
whole playoffs. Yeah.
Yeah, he was one of the main reasons, if not the
Mm-hmm.
main reasons, why the Pittsburgh Steelers were able to get into the Super Bowl. And so, a lot of folks, and including myself, think that maybe perhaps Ben Roethlisberger was stolen a Super Bowl MVP. But when you look at that entire playoff performance by Santonio Holmes, I think that it's rightfully so. But to circle back, Hardwig was a part of that team.
Mm-hmm.
He was a part of the team that got to hoist the Sticky Lombardi #6. And, I think that he may be one of those guys that is extremely underrated amongst, being overshadowed by such great players, that the Pittsburgh Steelers have had in the position. And so I know you mentioned a little bit earlier about how Mason Cole stacks up to the current, or, how the current player Mason Cole would stack up to these greats. Do you ever see a Mason Cole being able to, be in the, I guess, same breath of air as some of these guys?
No, the guys that we're talking about that have that longevity uh, with Webster and Dawson and Pouncey, I think Pouncey will be in the Hall of Fame. It was a travesty that Demonte Dawson had to wait like 3 years to get in.
Yeah.
I thought it was ridiculous, but it was at a point of time where there was a lot of great players going in
Mhm.
each year, and it kind of because Webster was first ballot, Dawson should have been first ballot because Dirt was that good. But I think Pouncey will, but I think you'll have to wait a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, he, like I said, he did have that one weakness, and teams knew how to hinder the Steelers' interior running game, especially as he got older. So, but I love Mason Cole. I just think that people are sleeping on him.
Mhm.
Everybody's like, well, we got to get our next great center, and they're going to draft an upgrade. And it wouldn't shock me at all to see Mason Cole excel this year. Being, sandwiched between Samalu and and Daniels. I mean, that's my opinion, the best guard tandem in the NFL. And with Cole's communication, his leadership, I think he's going to be. He knows he's the starter going into camp, so I think he's going to really get stronger, work on anything he needed to work on. It wouldn't shock me to see him get a second contract, and the Steelers look elsewhere with their draft picks and stuff like that, because Mason Cole's not an elderly player. He's just now entering his prime, and I just think he's a lot better than people give him credit for.
I do too. I think he's better than what he gets credit for. He could be a guy that ends up having a lengthy career. He's still fairly young. I think he's in his early, mid-20s right now. And so, he could still have a lengthy career with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And, depending on what he does with that career could determine where he lands amongst the greats. I don't think he has the pedigree there, to get up there. But, you never know. I mean, if Hartwig or Hardings can get up there, I think Mason Cole has that opportunity. I think health is going to play a big role. And, I think what also helps him is his surrounding cast. Having a Sam Malu on one side and a James Daniels on the other doesn't hurt. And so I think that's only going to get better.
That Mason Cole can't be like a Jeff Hardy's.
Right.
Because, some guys we're talking about, Demonte Dawson and Marquise Pouncey were elite athletes. Mike Webster was freakishly strong and tough and durable, and a good athlete because he could pull and everything.
Right.
Mason Cole don't measure up in those two categories with those guys, but he is kind of more of a fit for today's NFL and the way teams play and the way they utilize their offensive linemen. We're going to see a lot of outside zone, I believe, moving forward since they've upgraded at guard and at tackle. So I think that he's just a really good fit for the culture. Just like I said about Hardings buying in to the legacy of the position, I believe Mason Cole does too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think he does. And like we said, having those players around him are going to be very helpful for his continued development. And so as we do when we talk about these position players and this position ranking, who would you replace our current Mason Cole currently with a player in their prime of the past? Is there anybody in particular? Would you keep Mason?
Well, I mean, if you could bring up a Webby or Demonte Dawson, here's the thing: as great as Mike Webster was, and what we got to remember is a lot of those guys on them Steel Curtain teams, they were surrounded by Hall of Fame players.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes a difference. And it will on some of the voting as this series goes on. Right. But Mike Webster did not have other Hall of Fame players next to him. Mike Webster was the center of everything, the center of that foundation on the offensive line. And he was the Hall of Famer. Mm-hmm. That cast changed around him through the years. He was the one constant. So therefore, that is the difference. But Webster, if you brought him to today, he still would be 6'1", and he'd probably be maybe 300 pounds now. But so for that reason, I would have to say Demonte Dawson would be the guy that I would bring to the modern Pittsburgh Steelers, because Dawson had more size than, he was also super strong. Nobody was strong like Webster, but Dawson was strong. Dirt could get it done. But Dirt had that athleticism, that ability to move. He could play in this era easily and dominate. There's nobody playing today, and I'm a big Creed Humphrey fan with the Chiefs at center, but there's nobody in today's game that could touch Demonte Dawson.
I agree 100%. I think that would be the player that I would be bringing back as well. Yeah. I think that, when you mentioned Webster, he's a guy that I didn't get a chance to see, but he's also a guy that you mentioned that you can't coach size. You can't coach him up to be taller, things like that. And so Demonte Dawson, I would select him over for instance, like a Marquise Pouncey because of the bull rush and the size aspect of that.
Yep.
You know, Marquise Pouncey's a little bit on the smaller end. And, you know, when you have and you see what the Pittsburgh Steelers are doing offensively with their offensive line, it seems like they're adding girth and weight and size.
Big time.
And so I don't know if you want to put somebody small in the middle there. So,
well, his arms were short.
Yeah.
I mean, Wemby's arms were short. And that would be a problem with these monsters they have now. These guys like Chris Jones at 6'6", 6'7". I mean, he would be at a disadvantage lengthwise. And we see what happened to Kendrick Green. You try to put a guy with short, you know, as they say, T-Rex arms in there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult job for them boys.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it'd be interesting to see Mike Webster going up against Jordan Davis. I mean, those are some big difference in size there. And so 100%. And so for me, I think that Dermontti Dawson would be the guy that I would also bring back. His ability to get out and his athleticism and his size and his strength, I think, kind of put that all together for today's NFL and today's, you know, offensive line, and especially with today's Steelers offensive line, like I mentioned, you know, building up the girth, getting in, you know, the big guys, so to speak. So yeah, I think this was a great podcast, man. I really enjoyed it. Do you have any final words before we let everybody go?
No, just I think that each position we're trying to build up.
Yeah,
and each position, this was one that there was such a legacy that I wanted to make sure that we got to focus on the centers. Now, next week, we're going to go cornerback, and we know it's going to be the big two, and that's going to be interesting and a fun discussion. But we're going to, you know, the final week, the final Monday, before training camp starts, is the granddaddy of them all. It's the quarterback position. And I know that there is two camps, and there is passionate people in both camps, and we're going to try to put this debate to rest once and for all. So these next 2 weeks is going to be interesting.
It sure will. I'm looking forward to the cornerback position because there's that position's had a couple of, but yeah, you're right. There's two at the top. And you know, the same thing at the quarterback position. That's going to be a big debate, and I'm looking forward to it. You know, if you guys haven't checked out the audio side only, go check out wherever you find your audio podcasts, you know, whether it's Google, Apple, Spotify, the whole 9 yards. Just search up Steel Curtain Network. You'll find us on Saturdays. I have an episode called State of the Steelers. It's on the audio side only. Make sure you go back and check that out. Without further ado, Shannon, take us out.